Kyle Whittingham announced that Cam Rising is not on Utah's roster. That's right, Bad Moon Rising is finally leaving Utah football. What does it mean for the future? We're reacting to it all on today's Locked On Utes.
You are Locked On Utes, your daily podcast on the Utah Utes. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for making Locked On Utes your first listen and view of the day. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, available wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube. If it's your first time listening, make sure you like and subscribe. Love interacting with all the YouTube comments, and you can follow us on social media at Locked On Utes. My name is JT Wistersill, former intern inside the University of Utah Athletic Department. Excited to be joined by Moose Bingham, a former Utah kicker, recruiting extraordinaire, basically, as well, too. Utah Preps podcast host. Moose does a little bit of everything, and we got a lot to talk about today. Kyle Whittingham revealed Utah's plan of how they use their NIL and how they build their roster. Talk about that, some 26 recruiting information, but absolutely have to start with the news that's been a long time in the making, it seemed like, but Cam Rising is no longer on Utah's roster. Kyle Whittingham said that him and Cam have talked a few times, and he'll let Cam himself divulge his plan, but he's no longer on our roster. We'll let him announce what his plans are when he wants to. My reaction is I'm not shocked by this. The Devin Dampier addition, the other quarterback moves, it didn't make sense with his injury history for Cam to return to Utah. Wish him nothing but the best, an absolute legend, but I felt like this was in both parties' best interest, Moose.
I absolutely agree. You look at Coach Beck coming in, he looks for what's called a quarterback, is what he calls it. Because Thor had just come out and he had Taysom Hill, and he's like, I need quarterbacks that play like this. And he's looked for that everywhere he goes. Guys that are dual threat, that can get around the pocket, that can buy time for the offensive line, that make everything go. And you look at him, he'd go empty a lot last year because Devin Dampier was basically a running back. And so he's like 5 wide receivers, maybe 2 tight ends, 3 receivers, and let our quarterback be our running back and see what we can do. And it confuses defenses. It does a lot of things. But Cam Rising doesn't fit that mold at this point in his career. He's a 64-year-old man. Just kidding. But he's up there. He's in his 8th year of playing. A lot of guys that he came out with are like Trevor Lawrence. You see dudes that were freshmen the same time he was, and it's like these guys are on their 2nd contract. Cam, most likely, what I hope for him is that he finds an offense that fits his style, goes, plays, gets as far in the playoffs as possible, and then goes out into the NFL. He needs that extra year to get out of the injury bug cycle. And if he can do that, we're going to be in a good situation. But it's oil and water right now. It just doesn't mix.
It didn't for the last couple of years. I actually want to get back to Cam in one moment. You said something I find very interesting, and I do agree with at times that Devin Dampier they just utilized his running more than anything. I do feel confident in Devin Dampier's ability to lead Utah back to a Big 12 contender status this coming year. You talked about his running ability. How much faith do you have in Devin Dampier's arm for Utah football?
You know what? His arm is very interesting. He had 12 touchdowns, 12 interceptions. He was learning. He's a young kid. I mean, he's not on his 8th, 9th year. He was learning a lot, and he was doing it with a cast that doesn't look like Utah's. Mm-hmm. I mean, you put roster to roster against each other. New Mexico wasn't Utah, but I love that they're reworking the Utah offense. I love what Coach Beck says. He's like, we're looking for guys we can trust. I don't care if it's tight ends. I don't care if it's wide receivers. I don't care if it's running backs. I don't care if it's a quarterback. I want guys I can trust out there. And that's going to make Utah's offense unlock to a whole new level because it's not just forcing the 12 personnel or the 13 personnel or the 14 personnel. It's saying, hey, who's our best guy out here that we can trust? Let's get him the ball. And it's been really interesting because Coach Beck has put tight ends in the NFL. He's put receivers in the NFL. He's put quarterbacks in the NFL, and he's put linemen in the NFL. So you're sitting there and you're like, what is he going to do? And no one knows. And that's what makes it so exciting to watch a Beck offense because he pulls from everywhere. He's super smart, and he adjusts to the roster. And I think in this day and age, that changes everything. But Devin Dampier as a thrower, I think is really good. But he's not going to have to run as much when you've got Fano and you've got Lomu protecting the bookends. And I think we'll figure out the interior this time around. But Devin Dampier, if he does get some A-gap pressure, he's fast enough, he's slick enough to run outside, find his target, and deliver a strike, and he doesn't have to force it as much anymore. At New Mexico, he had to put up 50 points a game to win. With this Utah defense, you don't have to force the ball. It's okay going and letting the punter punt. As long as the ball hits the foot of a kicker or punter at the end of a series, I'm considering it a win because Utah's defense is going to be that good this next year.
Yeah, I'm excited about what the defense can do. Really excited about what Devin Dampier can do too. And guy only sacked 4 times last year, to your point, Moose. So he's got the ability to get out of pressure, and that is something that'll be big for Utah. Getting back to Cam Rising, we touched on it a little bit, and I like the analogy you used of water and oil. Just unfortunately for Cam too, the best ability a quarterback can have is availability, and Cam Rising, simply put, was just not available enough. The injuries plagued him. You couldn't move forward with him as your starting quarterback, in my opinion, because if you bring him in, if you say, oh, Cam Rising's our guy, then the best quarterbacks in the country are not going to want to come to your program because they're going to be like, why would I be a backup? Versus you can land a guy like Devin Dampier because Dampier sees a path to start, doesn't have to deal with the quarterback controversy of, oh, if Cam Rising is healthy, will he be the guy? Questions remain too, just after so many continued injuries. Like, will Cam ever be the quarterback he was in 2022? I don't know that. And I'd be curious to see what his announcement is. He chose not to enter the fall or the winter portal. That leads me to think he's going to declare for the NFL draft, but nothing has been made official yet. But a lot of love for Cam Rising, as we said at the end of the day too, Moose, and definitely just wild that this is how it ends up played out. I thought Cam was going to be the one to announce it. He still gets to be that one, but by waiting, he kind of forced Kyle Whittingham's hand to have to make a statement about it.
Yeah, he did, and maybe he's ready to go to the NFL, give it that shot and go. And if he is, kudos to him. Maybe he's like, I want to get into coaching. There's so many things because as of right now, his injury record, it's not a draftable position at this point. So maybe he at quarterback too, like there's only like in all reality, teams take 2, maybe 3 quarterbacks, maybe 3. And so it's a losing proposition if they're not invested in you and you're just a fringe draftable guy. And so there's too many question marks right now for him. I think the best thing for him to do would be go play another year if he's allowed it, or get on with his life and start coaching or doing whatever makes him happy.
Yeah, I would agree. If I was advising Cam, I would say probably go into coaching. I would if he could get back to health, would love to see him try and chase an NFL spot. UDFA at best, as you and I both agree, Moose. And even at that, like I said, could be tough. Maybe he would even have to go to a USFL and try to work his way up from there just because of what the injuries have been. And that's where maybe a college team will be interested in trying to bring him on, as he is a guy, if he can stay healthy, who's accomplished a lot compared to what most college quarterbacks have. So we'll keep an eye on Cam Rising. But at the moment, too, and we'll do an episode once he finally makes his statement about just his legacy and the impact he's had on the Utah football program. But as Kyle Whittingham said, Cam Rising is officially no longer on the Utah football roster. Speaking of the Utah football roster, Kyle Whittingham did share Utah's plan of how they went about building this roster, what they prioritized in terms of keeping their own talent, as well as what they looked for in the portal. Going to talk about the plan that Kyle Whittingham revealed and how it affects Utah in one moment. But first, today's episode of Locked On Utes is brought to you by our friends at Wayfair. After the holiday hustle, there's nothing like giving your home a little TLC. I always find that decluttering and refreshing my space helps me get back into a routine. Whether you're tidying up, cleaning out, or just want to give your space a new look to start the year, Wayfair has everything you need, all within your budget. I'm currently looking for furniture, and their huge selection makes it easy to find pieces that fit my style and budget. My favorite part, the free, hassle-free delivery. Even for the larger items, Wayfair sites was so aggressive and just easy to navigate. I found everything I needed in no time. What is your decor style? Why did you pick these items? What do you love about them? Wayfair makes it easy for you to figure it out. They make it easy to tackle your new year home goals with endless inspiration for your space. There's something for everyone and every style, every home too. There's no matter your space or budget, you can find what you need at Wayfair. And did you know Wayfair helps you out in a time crunch? The delivery fee, fast, hassle-free, they got your back. Give your home the refresh it needs with Wayfair. Head to wayfair.com right now. That's Wayfair, Wayfair.com. Wayfair, every style, every home today. All right, Moose, talking about the Utah football roster, it's drastically different. And Kyle Whittingham, it was great to hear from him, Jason Beck for the first time, and Morgan Scalley in their press conference that they had yesterday. And in that press conference, there's a lot of things we'll have to get to on a future show. But one of the things I really wanted to talk about was how he talked about how Utah went about building this roster. They talked about the NIL priorities, and those were retention was one thing that they really focused on. It was at the top, and then talked about how they kind of looked at each position almost like they used an NFL model to build this roster out. And I do think this is the best way to do it. I think the biggest thing, just like in terms of recruiting, right? You want to recruit your own state. Well, when you got really good players, you want to keep them. So I like that retention was at the top of Utah's offseason list. And then using that NFL model of how do we build our roster? Who do we offer the most NIL money to? How do we look at the guys we want to bring in then too? I do think this is a really smart way that Kyle Whittingham and co have employed building a roster in 2025.
Yeah, so this is kind of my bread and butter. That's what War Room is. It was built on. So we literally go in and we're like, hey, here's your roster. Here's your depth charts. Let's put them online. How much money do you have at this position? How much money do you have at this position? How much money do you have at this position? And you look at it and you're like, is the guy in the portal better than the guys we already have? That's what you have to ask yourself. Mm-hmm. And most of the time, the answer is no. Utah has done a phenomenal job developing guys. But because they've done such a good job developing guys, some of those guys are enticed to hit the portal because they know they're better than at least 80 other teams starting at their position. And so they're like, some of these teams want to pay me a lot of money. And so it's interesting to hear what Witt's doing. And we can see what they've done. You look at the 2025 class. They signed 2 quarterbacks. They signed 2 running backs. They signed 2 receivers, 3 offensive linemen, 5 defensive linemen. They signed 3 linebackers. They signed 5 defensive backs. And then they have like some athletes in there as well. 2 athletes, and then Dylan Curtis, a kicker. So they're still going heavy in the high school realm. Some of these P4 teams, they're signing like 12 high school kids. Utah is going bigger in the high school because their bread and butter is developing and keeping guys in. It's interesting. You talk to different teams. Dan Lanning came out and said that his biggest recruiting at the end of the season is his own team. And you're seeing a lot of teams that they're echoing that sentiment. They're like, we've got to keep our guys and make sure no one else is coming in. Because it's not just, hey, I want the top guys from that team, so I'm a coach and I'm going to call them. No, you're at risk for losing your job. But if one of your boosters calls and offers them something and DMs them on Twitter or whatever, there's opportunities there. That's the crazy thing. And there's nothing the coaches can do to control that either. And so that's what's crazy about college football. There's no processes in place to stop open recruiting.
Yeah.
And that's kind of out of control. And it's tough to see. But yes. I think that most of these teams that are good do a great job keeping their players in-house.
Yeah, and Utah, for the most part, has been able to do that. This was one of the rare years where that hasn't worked out as they would have hoped. So now that we know, retention's the top thing with Utah, and now we know that that's the priority, we can also look at, hey, they use the NFL model to value their positions for where they add guys in the portal. So if we look at what Utah brought in through the portal class, this is how I see Utah viewing their roster building method. Number one, it's clear they still value quarterback above all else. I also want to make this clear. I'm talking about how Utah has chosen to build their roster through the portal. Utah has faith in, and they've done a really good job developing their offensive line. Clearly, they only added 1 offensive lineman through the portal cycle this year. I don't think they added any last year. So they just haven't really touched on the offensive line too much. I think that would be a higher priority in other years. But when you look at the portal cycle this year, felt like quarterback was their top priority. Felt like wide receiver was their second biggest priority. Then I would say cornerback. You could say running back was a higher priority maybe, but I don't know if that was a higher priority in terms of like how Utah builds their roster as much as it was, we have a drastic need at running back because everyone is gone. And obviously they landed Wayshawn Parker, so that was a massive get. And then defensive end, I thought was a priority too. What do you feel like Kyle Whittingham and Utah's roster priorities are, Moose? And do they match up similar to how you would build how you would have your roster positional value board?
So a roster positional value board, it's always interesting. It's number one, what you can get. Mm-hmm. Utah can't sit there and be like, we're going to throw money at a 5-star because that just depletes your NIL. So what can you get within reason and quickly? So if I'm Utah, I'm like, number one, what's our offensive identity want to be? Coach Beck likes to throw the ball. He likes to spread it out, and he likes to be a lot of times in situations where it's not just run the ball down their throats and control the clock like Whittingham has done in the past. This is a different offensive coordinator than Whittingham has ever had. Mm-hmm. And he's had to loosen the controls and let him do what he needs to do. That's why a lot of the running backs hit the portal. That's why some tight ends hit the portal. But it's why it's attracting a lot of receivers as well. So if I'm to put value, I'm going to see who's going to be catching the ball. And I'm going to put a little more value on receiver than I have in running back in the past. I'm going to put a little more value on O-line than I have in the past to make sure my quarterback is healthy, because that is what we've seen from Utah, the number one thing. Healthy quarterback means winning games. When you're down to your fifth string quarterback, no matter how talented they are, they were fifth string for a reason going into the season. And so you're sitting there, you're like, okay, keep the quarterback up, get the ball out, and then get to the quarterback. The way you get to the quarterback, having great coverage and having good pass rush, whether that's from linebacker or D-line, it doesn't matter. Get yourself a great pass rusher to eat at the other team's quarterback. And that's where you start the value, and then you go from there. And then you throw a ton of money, just a truckload, at the kickers.
Mm-hmm. Utah did get a punter in the portal, Moose. They did get a punter.
They did lose a punter too. And I like the punter we lost. I'm like, oh no, that's a bad loss.
I know. Texas can't compete with that NIL money. They're just lucky they beat ASU with some of those missed calls and things like that. But anyways, Moose, I want to talk also now about, so we've talked about how Utah kind of looks at things. I want to see if it matches up to how you and I would do this. So if we're starting, because Utah looks at it from an NFL standpoint. So if you and I were GM, this is what I want to do, talking about how we would kind of build our roster, placing the importance on position. I have my list here, and I'm curious if yours would match up. I have quarterback as the most important position when you're building a roster. Then I would go offensive tackle. Third, I would go defensive end. After that, I would go wide receiver. And honestly, after my top three, I think there's a clear top three, and then it kind of fluctuates for me a little bit. I went wide receiver. Then from there, I went with defensive tackle, interior line, cornerback, linebacker, safety, running back, tight end. I have a clear top three, and then you can kind of shuffle the other ones around. How do you view roster building and positional importance?
So roster building, it always starts with the quarterback. You're absolutely correct in your assessment right there. Your team will go as far as your quarterback will take you. We know that. Then protect the quarterback. Number two, offensive tackle. I don't agree with you at wide receiver, because if you have a good enough quarterback, he'll make the receiving room better. Sure. And if he's upright, that means you have good O-line, good tackles. That means he's got time to find receivers. If you've got a quarterback running for his life, it's just not good. So number three, I actually go for corner, because if you can,
I had D end at 3, like pass rush.
Yeah, I go corner because especially in Utah, because we can find D ends on the street. D ends are a great commodity that we have in Utah. There's a lot of high school kids here that can rush the passer. Okay. We have OFA Academy. We've got great offensive and defensive linemen in this state. Finding elite corners, there's only one Smith Snowden every 3 or 4 years. And so you have to have 2 or 3 of those guys ready to go. Okay. And so for Utah, I'd put a premium on corner for that reason. And then I'd go defensive end. Okay. And then I'd go running back, because those late games in the season, you have to have a running back to grind out those first downs, seal games, and then I'd go receiver.
Mm-hmm. I like it.
It's a little different, I know, but it's hard to put a price on all these guys. And what's interesting is there's a market out there. So if you're a tight end, You're like, this is what the top of the market is. This is what the bottom of the market is. And the market dictates what a player is worth. So top quarterback, we could be looking at 2, 3, 4 million a year. Mm-hmm. But if you were willing to take like a middle tier quarterback, maybe that's $1 million a year. And then you could spread out that wealth all over. So that's where it becomes tough to look at your NIL, what you've got going on, and how much money you have to play with, because you're like, I can land the number 1 tight end in the country for $400,000. Mm-hmm. Is that better than getting the number 5 tackle, or whatever the number is? I'm putting placeholders there.
It's the roster balancing and constructing is crazy right now in the sports. I was ready to jump on you for your, Utah for the offensive line thing. Cause at first I was like, well, Utah finds corners all the time too. But your point about they're not in the state of Utah develops offensive linemen overall better than and defensive linemen too, better than they do cornerbacks. That I totally agree with when you look at the overall history. There's some really good players, and Utah has consistently brought in good cornerbacks, but it seems the offensive linemen and D linemen usually been a little more frequent than a Smith Snowden. For the outside of him, like the best cornerback to come out of Utah in the past few years. Obviously, there was a safety in Bountiful, who I'm just blanking on his name. He's at BYU now. He was the top player in last year's class.
Falatau Satawala.
Thank you very much. That's who I was thinking of there. So
before that, you'd go like Ike Larson. Like you can find safeties, but corners are very difficult to find in this state. There is one coming up. It's Gennaro Guilford Jr., and I think he's the next best corner to come out. He'll end up being about 6'3", but his dad is on the staff at BYU.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this roster building can be so challenging. Also, the player you just mentioned, what year is he?
He is a 27.
Okay, almost a perfect tease. But we are about to talk about the class of 2026 overall group in one moment. But first, today's episode of Locked On Utes is brought to you by our friends at Rocket Money. Rocket Money has your back, because with Rocket Money today, you can start saving more on those unwanted subscriptions. Did Rocket Money help you find any subscriptions you forgot about or that you were paying for twice? That definitely happened to me. I had a few subscriptions that I didn't even realize I was still paying for, and Rocket Money made it so easy to track them all down. It's like having a personal assistant for your finances. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps you find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps you lower your bills so you can grow your savings. Brings everything together in one place, whether it's subscriptions on your saving and spending habits, or even the goals you want to hit this year. Rocket Money has over 5 million users, and that is a total of 500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year while using all of the app's premium features. For me, one of the best features is that subscription tracker. I've used it to cancel services I wasn't using anymore, and I've already saved a ton. Plus, with their goals feature, I've been able to automatically set aside money for my future. No more stressing about budgeting every month. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon today. That's rocketmoney.com/lockedon. rocketmoney.com/lockedon today. All right, Moose. Right now, BYU currently has a better football program than Utah. If you look at this recent year in success, finished inside the top 20. They just the recruiting class that they've been able to bring into. They've landed some of the top guys recently, and they've landed some top transfers too, getting Tanu Vasa to come, and that's concerning. So there is a little bit of a battle. This is the first time I think in a couple of years we could say BYU's been better than Utah, especially after the season the Cougars had. And this feels like a big year in the class of 2026 to try and land some guys. There are currently, first I want to know how big this class is, because I think there are several 4-stars and just elite players that Utah would love to land. And I'll also ask this to you. How concerning is it that Utah currently has no player in the class of 2026 in the state committed to them?
So this class is honestly just incredible. Let's start out with that. When you have Brock Harris, who I love, his dad is amazing. His whole family is amazing. When I first met Brock, he legitimately scared me, and that's hard to do. It's usually basketball players that do that. But it's very concerning that there's no committed 26 players. Not like to the point where you're like, okay, the sky is falling by any stretch, but you have top players in this class. I mean, you've got Isun Taufa, who's committed to Washington out of Corner Canyon. You've got Taden Kava'a at quarterback. You've got Salisi Moa. He's an athlete that you've got Oregon, you've got USC, you've got so many schools coming in to see Salisi. Brock Harris, who I've already mentioned. Helaman Kasuga, committed to Texas A&M. Bamui Tolo, committed to Oregon. You've got the Pula twins, committed to UCLA. You've got Ami Mawala, committed to Oregon as well. You've got Isa Nalie. You've got Keo Akana. You've got Adam Bywater. I really like Adam as well. He's just in the suburbs of Salt Lake at Olympus. Graham Livingston already has an offer from Utah, had 1,600 yards this last year. I mean, you've got Tongi Havea, 6'6", 300 pounds coming out of Lehigh. Legend Glasker blew my mind last year. He was an absolute dog. Ifo Peely at edge at Granger, 6'5", 255. PJ Takitaki's committed to BYU. Devon Eka, he's a running back out of Lehigh that's really, really good as well. You've got Jesse King at Timpanogos. I mean, Brighton Niu. I haven't even gotten to Brighton, and I love Brighton out of Lehigh. He's got offers to Oklahoma. You've got the Moala kid out of Kaysville, out of Davis. You've got Kai Meza, Tolly Benjamin out of Lehigh, at Skyridge. I mean, all of these kids, Miller Carter, Coniel Sweetwine, Kai Wesley has offers all over the country, 6'7", 235. I mean, you look at this class and you're just like, if Utah doesn't land some of these kids, I think the fans are going to riot because this class is so important. This class, if BYU beats Utah in it, Utah no longer has the P4 affiliation that BYU didn't have for years. There was an uneven playing field. When I was coming out, I was like, if you don't go to Utah, you're an idiot because you're playing against top competition. Now that playing field is even.
Yeah.
Utah doesn't have this huge budget for recruiting where BYU doesn't. They're even members starting in 2025. So Utah has a little bit of a financial boost right now over BYU, but that dissipates in July of this year. And so it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the next little bit. But I think Utah can land some of these kids, but they're going to have to recruit like they've never recruited before.
Well, what hurts Utah is they're not just going against BYU. BYU only has one player so far in the class of 26, at least on 24/7 Sports' rankings of the top football recruits in Utah committed to them. The rest are Big Ten and even SEC bound. And I think that's the concerning thing. That's actually, unfortunately, they're all former Pac-12 school bound, but they are, of course, getting that Big Ten money. So that's where it really hurts. And I think that's something that the gap in NIL is something that's going to continue to be a problem. We saw last year, Jerome Miles silently committed to Utah. Then he bounces around from SEC school to Big Ten school. We got Aaron Dunn is another guy who ends up leaving Utah to go for a Big Ten school. And there's been other guys too who continue to end up going for the at Big Ten and SEC over a Big 12 squad. So I think that makes it tough, not just for Utah, but BYU as well, Moose, right? You're not just competing to keep guys in the state. Now you're trying to offer them as much NIL as you can, or at least enough to compete with what the big dogs can offer.
Yeah, it was interesting. In years prior, a lot of schools were like, oh, we don't even go to Utah. That's a flyover state. Nowadays, when you have teams like Corner Canyon beating IMG, when you have teams that are doing what they're doing here, and the development and the players in the NFL, when you've got a Puka Nacua that is doing what he's doing, all these other schools are like, maybe we should go to the state of Utah and take those big defensive linemen. Like, it was interesting in the playoffs this year. I'm seeing big Polynesians on all the teams. I'm like, that dude has a tribal tap. What's he doing there and not at the U or BYU or like wherever? How did they get him to Texas or wherever, so it's interesting to see. But the 26 recruiting, this has been a pivotal class, and I've been yelling it from the rooftops for years. And whoever can secure this class may be in the driving seat for the Big 12 for years to come.
Yeah, they very well might be. It's looking promising right now that it's going to be one of the best we've ever seen. The question will be how many guys can Utah land in the end, and that is a question that will be interesting to end up seeing the answer to. Moose, always appreciate you making the time to come on. Where can everyone get more of your work at? And just tell everyone about all the things you're up to right now, my friend.
Well, we only have a little bit of an amount of time, but I'm heading out to Tampa. So you guys can catch me on the Utah Preps podcast still. You can catch me on Twitter at MooseB90. You can always reach out to me. I've got a course called Recruiting for Parents, helping you guys understand the recruiting game, what to ask for in NIL, what to do, all that stuff. I answer quickly and concisely in that course. Or if you have a very specific question, I do consultations as well.
Moose, you're the man. Appreciate making the time.
Anytime. Have a great one, JT.
And safe travels down to Tampa too, my friend, and hope you enjoy the sunshine. Thank you, all of you who make Locked On Utes your first listen of the day. We'll be back with you tomorrow. We have so much still to touch on when it comes to Kyle Whittingham's comments. We hope you'll join us tomorrow.